What?
Time for what?
Experience in college.
Time for reinforcement.
Time for liftoff!
Where nothing is impossible unless you think it is impossible.
College.
My college scholarship.
Yes.
Boom.
College ran by real fast.
You hung in with the best college.
Touchdown!
First time for everything.
Well, what are you waiting for?
What are you waiting for?
Let's do this thing.
Genius, let's do this thing!
So welcome everyone to the show. We have a special guest. Happy and proud to say that I am a colleague of Jana Gaglietta, who has a vast training in various different areas, from liberal studies, emphasizing in education. She has not one, but two credentials as a learning specialist, from mild to moderate to also moderate to severe. And she'll tell us a little bit more about that. And also she has a master's degree. Yes, she does not know how to stop because she wants to give so much to students, special education, as well as also has done some work in educational therapy. Jana, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So why don't we start off with what got you interested in this field? I mean, you really dug deep into this profession. What got you into this world of helping students who have, as some people would say, learning disabilities? I've heard other students call superpowers as well, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so interestingly enough, I actually started out as a nursing major in college, but I always loved education. I did all my service hours in education when I was a student at St. Ignatius, and ended up just switching my major in college because I knew that this was my calling. And my mother actually is a special educator, so I spent a lot of time obviously hearing about what she was doing and seeing her work with students, and I just really, really appreciated that. And I myself am diagnosed with ADHD, and I know how critical this kind of support is to student success.
Now, you're right, because there's so many different learning styles out there. And so if I'm a parent or guardian or even a student, how do I figure out that I should maybe check out to see if I have a learning style that's not mainstream, that may need some extra support?
I'm a firm believer in the old adage, knowledge is power. So anytime anyone has any questions about how they learn, why they do things a certain way, if they're struggling or hitting a roadblock, I always recommend reaching out to a professional to get more advice and more insight on what is going on, how they learn, and what they might need to succeed.
Yeah, and so a lot of times, through the years, I'll hear students say, well, I'm just bad in math, right? Or I'm just a slow reader. But there's a lot more behind that, right? I think those are just easy things that people say, like, oh, I'm lazy, or I can't sit still. So a lot of times kids know something's not right, but it's sometimes the adults who tend to kind of like, no, everything's fine. Everything's fine because, I'm definitely from that older generation where there's a negative stigma if you have a different learning style.
Yes. And that definitely has improved quite a bit since I got into the field of education about 10 years ago, but it still exists. I work with teenagers right now, and every teenager just wants to fit in. They don't want to be judged, and they don't want to be different for any reason. So sometimes actually the stigma these days can fall more on the students. The students are feeling more pressure to fit in than the parents. So it kind of goes both ways. And so the process does involve breaking that down just a little bit and helping kids to understand that individuality, is just the way our world works, and it's no different for education.
Yeah, and I think that's a key thing, is just like you said before, is asking those questions, right? And I want to also add that, I think in the last century, yes, that's how long I've been doing this for, there was a lawsuit at the UC Berkeley because historically the UC system used to ask, do you have a learning disability or not? And people assumed students were being discriminated. And the admissions folks that I worked with said, it's so sad that we won't know who has a learning disability or not because they usually don't volunteer this information. and quote, we don't know who are the super strong students, because if you know how to rise above an educational system that tends to, speak on the national level, is very mainstream for one type of learner, the colleges can't see, those hidden superheroes that are out there. So how do you work with students? Because, you work in a learning center that's not open to all students, right? To support everyone. So you and your colleagues in the learning center must see some kids who hit some roadblocks over and over. How's the best way? Because you're right on the money, right? The kids don't want to seem like they put these negative labels, really not realizing that they've been super strong despite it all.
Yes. And I try to honestly normalize struggle and hardship, because we all experience it in our lives. And high school is 4 years long, and it's not a reasonable expectation to think that the whole thing is going to be rosy and smooth sailing, right? So kids are going to struggle at certain points in their high school career. So I don't like to limit our services to just students who have diagnosed learning differences. We open it up to everybody. And especially now during COVID, we've got kids who are really struggling with aspects of distance learning, so they're getting support from us. And then we still kind of keep up with our students who have learning differences to make sure that they're getting what they need as well. So it's definitely multifunctional in here, and I really like having sort of a flexible atmosphere so that kids can come in with anything, and we will welcome them. And if we can help them, great. And if not, we'll point them in the right direction, so that nobody feels like they have to struggle or go through hardships alone. Even though they're inevitable, in our lifetime, it doesn't mean that we have to go through them alone, right?
Oh, no. Nobody wants to be alone.
Right.
Even the people who say I'm loners don't really want to be alone. Let's just be honest.
And that's what's funny, is because you see loners, but usually they travel in groups. So
Yes.
It's like it's a group of loners, so they're not really loners.
Exactly. Now, your model is not something that's traditionally used in many different places. Have you seen in recently that has been changing in variety of educational systems, right? Because, the college system, I'm just going to focus on what I'm more familiar, like research in public schools, or they have a center for a learning disability, but only people with learning disability can access those services. Do you see there's a change of that model, or you still think it's still business as usual?
No, I think depending on the place, there is a change in that model. I want to say it was about 2 decades ago, there was a new special ed system that came out called Response to Intervention. And this was basically a solution to the whole wait to fail phenomenon. Basically, people were upset saying that, we have to wait until my kid is failing in order for the district to test my child, right? And parents obviously didn't like that, because their kid has to dig themselves a huge emotional and educational hole before the district will agree to dig them out. So response to intervention basically means if a student is struggling, they have what's called an RTI specialist who moves in and starts applying interventions for these students. The interventions are on different levels, so you start applying Tier 1 intervention. If that doesn't work, you move up to Tier 2, and then if that doesn't work, you move up to Tier 3. And if that doesn't work, then you get the student tested. So that way these kids are able to get support with what they need without having to be tested and identified. Doesn't mean they still can't get that, but it just means that we don't have to wait for them to get into this huge hole before they get tested. And that's kind of what I like to do here. A lot of schools will have the model, especially private schools, where if a parent comes and says their student is really struggling, the school says we need to have documentation of a diagnosis, right? And that can be really limiting on a lot of families for many reasons. One of the biggest being cost, right? So instead, I like to bring them in, find out what's going on, and see if we can apply some interventions first and see how that works before, bringing testing into the picture.
No, and I think that's really important, right? Because there may just be a struggle, right? Like maybe something was only taught a certain way, and you just need a different way of looking at it. It may not be, a disability on there. And I think that's really important. And I love that there is this new model, because for someone who's been, doing this for so long, you talk about the emotional struggle. Like, I have to fail in order for me to succeed. Like, failures could be a learning block, but it's struggle when you're trying to get into that high school or that college as well. And I like you said, talk to, the teachers, the counselors, go to wherever learning support. I know like here in the city, and you may know other resources too, like support for families with disabilities. There's a lot of resources that are free for families. Are there other ones that, for people who are just kind of thinking about it so they don't feel alone that they should look at?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think that the resources that you look for depend a lot on what questions you're trying to have answered and what you are trying to get support for. And I think the first place that I would start is having the parents, and you can find like little guides or pamphlets on the internet about this, but having the parents find one that can guide them through their rights. If their child is diagnosed with a disability, what their rights are and what they can get from the school district at no cost. The reason is because the more you advocate for your child and the more you ask for things, the more your child's going to get. It's just kind of how it works. So I recommend starting there. And for getting kids tested, there are so many amazing practitioners in San Francisco. And actually, one of the benefits from COVID, if there is one, is that a lot of these psychologists are getting their practices set up to test kids virtually. So now you can even find a practitioner somewhere else in the state who can still provide reliable and accurate testing for your child. And you may be able to find a professional who charges a cheaper fee, or a practitioner who works on a sliding scale or does payment plans, takes insurance. That's another way to do it. So I always tell parents, look at what your rights are, advocate with the school district, talk to your pediatrician, right? Talk to everybody. Talk to your community, because that's where those little nuggets of information come from.
Oh, I know. I keep on telling everyone, keep on knocking on a door until one opens, because there is one ready for you. You just have to have that determination and love for yourself or for your child enough so to get it done. Now, you mentioned over and over again being a self-advocate. For how is someone supposed to be a self-advocate? And these are the individuals who already know they have different learning styles. Sometimes I have some middle school families who apply, like, I don't want them to know they have a learning disability because they may not get accepted. To others, while they're a high schooler, right? It's a very different dynamic. To someone even applying to college, right? And continuing the support services that they may want to continue. Yeah.
So the first part of that was self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is a skill. And we expect that different kids are going to have that skill to different levels depending on their age and their ability, right? And it is a skill that can be taught to the students. So that's something that I work with my kids on. I teach it directly and explicitly, and I also always start teaching it with where the student is at in that moment. So, for example, I had a student who did not advocate for herself at all. And it wasn't that she didn't know how to. She was very articulate and able to talk to the teachers very well, but she had some really negative experiences in the past, so she was fearful. So for that student, I would start off in a different place and use different strategies than a student who has a speech and language issue and just can't find the words to talk to the teachers, so they avoid it, right? So that's a really important thing to do. And then when the kids get to college, what I usually tell them to do when they're applying to colleges is to find the universities that they'd like to attend, and then look up on their website what their support services are like. And then once they find them, they need to take notes and information on those programs and ask questions about it when they go to these schools for, their on-campus tours and things like that. And make sure that they're interviewing those programs, because the student is also they're not just applying to a college, but that college is vying to get them to go to their school as well, right? So I think that's really empowering to try to interview these programs and find out which one is going to support the best, and kind of go from there. And then you can kind of submit all of that documentation once you're admitted to the school. Then you go into the center and find support. That's usually how it works. Some universities